From the snap of the ball to the snap of the first bone is closer to 4 seconds than 5. One Mississippi. The quarterback of the Washington Redskins, Joe Theismann, turns and hands the ball to running back John Riggins. He watches Riggins run 2 steps forward, turn, and flip the ball back to him in what most people know as a flea flicker, but the Redskins call a throwback special. 2 Mississippi. Theismann searches for a receiver, but instead sees Harry Carson coming straight at him. And it goes on until Theismann's bone is broken by Lawrence Taylor coming from behind. And this book is about all these forces in the world that affect the value of a single boy, whose singular ability is to prevent the next Joe Theismann from having his leg broken by the next Lawrence Taylor. He's protecting the quarterback's blind side. And this is the beginning of the realization in the football mind that that's a really dangerous situation. It's one of the most gruesome things that's ever happened on a football field. This all happens so fast in real time. It's like, it's if you were watching on the television set, it's just boom, boom, and he's down and the bone's out of his skin and nobody can look. But you slow it down on the page and it has this effect. It's just like, ugh. And it had such an effect that even though the movie of The Blind Side comes along and reduces this book to like a fifth of what it actually is, it's taking a very narrow slice of the book and dramatizing it. They couldn't resist starting the movie with Sandra Bullock reading those lines. Those lines forced their way into the movie, even though maybe they shouldn't have even been there. So anyway, I like the beginning of that one. And I'm getting better. You can see me getting better. You can't control whether you're going to find the gold mine. You can only be open, you can only leave yourself with a slightly better probability of finding the gold mine. That you can skew the odds a bit. You can't just make it happen. You can't will it or force it. And the way you do this, it's sort of like how you go through life. It's leaving yourself open. And people don't do this naturally. I mean, in some cultures they do. In New Orleans, where I grew up, they do. You walk down the streets in New Orleans and you're really not allowed to pass someone without making eye contact and maybe having some chit chat. And that chit chat's the beginning of a story, possibly. You never know where that's gonna go. You started something. Often people move through life with their eyes down, not making eye contact, passing people on the street without making the chit chat. This is a microcosm of a larger problem. You're moving through the world without letting stories start. When I get asked how I found the story of The Blind Side, I always say, because it's true, it was an accident. So beat one. I go to see an old high school friend who I've not seen in 20 years or whatever it is. And he has just taken into his home a homeless 16-year-old black kid who goes to their kid's school, who is living out of garbage cans and living on the street and couch surfing in people's homes, but was in a bad way and was on his way out of the school because he wasn't functioning in school. And there was a kind of clearly like a weird Pygmalion thing going on where the wife of my high school friend was gonna make sure this kid didn't fail. And so I just started to watch this. Like, that's weird. I didn't think no way was I thinking, oh, this is a book. I was thinking, very odd that Sean Tuohy has taken this on board and cares about this total stranger and wants to make sure he doesn't fall through the cracks. Purely by accident, shortly after I met Michael Orr, I began having these conversations with the front office of the San Francisco 49ers. I was asking the brain trust of the 49ers, like, what's the equivalent of Moneyball in professional football? How money is spread across the field? And they gave me basically a spreadsheet. And it showed that something very strange had happened to football over the previous 15 years or so. That there was a person on the football field who had previously been the lowest paid player, one of the offensive linemen, had become the second highest paid player, and it was the left tackle and of the offensive line, and it was because he protected the most valuable player, the quarterback. He was kind of like an insurance policy, because the way the quarterbacks kept getting hurt was being hit in the back. One day, my old high school friend calls me and said a very odd thing has just happened. I said, what? He said, Michael Oher has been identified as a future NFL left tackle. And the left tackle had lots of peculiar physical attributes. He had especially big hands, especially long arms. Effectively, he was both elephant and ballerina. He was huge, but also incredibly nimble and agile. Michael had all these attributes, and no one had seen it. Not overnight, but pretty quickly, Michael Oher goes, having been like among the least valued 16-year-olds on the 15-year-olds on the planet, to being one of the most highly valued 17-year-olds on the planet. This journey was a matter of 18 months, and I thought, there's a story to write about our society, and it's about all the forces that have affected the value of this kid. And some of those forces are things that happen in football strategy to make the quarterback more valuable, and thus the left tackle more valuable. And the strategy got ever more refined, so people became more and more clear about what it was in this left tackle that you needed to protect the quarterback. But part of that was like having a mother, having a family, having a bed to sleep in.
Billy Beane and Michael Oher had this in common, that they were both misvalued when they were young. There was in opposite directions. Billy Beane was, the signals coming in on Billy Beane was he was a future Hall of Fame baseball player when he's 17 years old. And those forces, they completely distort the decisions he makes about what to do with his life. The forces coming in on Michael Oher when he's 14 years old or 15 is that he has no value at all. Never mind baseball, never mind football. It makes you think about the way people's perception of themselves gets distorted by the society's perception of them. They kind of take on whatever view of the world that other people have of them. And both Moneyball and The Blind Side are driven by the movement in these people's value. In the case of Billy Beane, the realization that no, he went the wrong direction because everybody said he was much better than he was. In the case of Michael Oher, it was, no, I'm much better than people said. But that movement was at the heart of both stories. I think a storyteller should always be looking for friction between reality and perception. Like places where the whole world is looking at something wrong and you can kind of show it. It's like it's just a huge opportunity when you can explain a mistake the world is making in the form of a character. It's just like you get the character's journey, but you also get all these things that you need to understand to explain the mistake.
It wasn't a biography of Michael Oher. It was a story about this person whose talents might have been completely missed in the first place had he not been extracted from a bad situation into a better situation, but whose life had been affected by all these things that had happened. And I could then build a story where you were watching these forces gather to affect him. You were watching what was happening in professional football that caused what he could do to become more valuable. You were watching the internal dynamics of that family where he had some buy-in and started to do well and better in school, discovered himself on the football field, all the things that happen when you had advantages rather than disadvantages. And it was a lovely structure. I loved that, having that simple structure, this thing, what are these forces that are dragging this kid from here to there? In the end, it ends up kind of telling itself. In The Blind Side, I'm using a pretty simple parallel structure in the storytelling. I'm telling both Michael Oher's story and the story of what was happening in football strategy on parallel tracks until they converge with Michael excelling on the football field. Essentially, in a parallel structure, you're incorporating multiple stories linked by a common character or themes. The stories unfold concurrently, and the stories provide multiple hooks to pique the interest of your audience. In The Blind Side, the reader's following the rise of the left tackle, who's charged with protecting the quarterback from injury, and the rise of Michael Orr, who winds up being considered one of the best left tackle prospects in America. This is like violating the spirit of masterclass, but because I think it's really important that people know, there's not one way to do this. That I have my way, and it will be useful to you maybe, but there are lots of different ways to skin this cat. But this is how I skin the cat. Broadly, what I think I'm doing in life is, and as a writer, is filtering the world for what's interesting, and then organizing what's interesting into a story. And my process starts with talking to people, or sometimes just wandering around observing scenes. I don't tape record anything. And I don't tape record anything because tape recording, you're not filtering. If you tape record, you're just sucking it all in. You're not making any decisions at all. And the building blocks of a story are characters and scenes and explanations. And I just think I then will get note cards, index cards, just like this. And I will lay out, I'll write up, they'll be color coded. In this case, orange cards are just characters of the story and the situations they're in and what they're doing. The yellow cards are ideas that are coming across, sometimes explicitly, sometimes implicitly, in the scene. And the green cards are sort of broad themes that the whole thing is exploring. And it just helps me to see possible different orders for things. And there's something you can do, and I do, like what happens if we do this? What happens if we throw that up there? What does that story feel like? Why don't you do it? So it gives you a chance to argue with your own structure. And it's as simple as moving a card. So that's much easier than rewriting a whole story. So this is a costless way, sort of, or a really inexpensive way to play with structure, the different ways the things might be laid out. The orange cards are characters, say Michael Orr or Sean Toohey and Leanne Toohey. The yellow cards are events or scenes, like the scene where Leanne Toohey sees a homeless Michael Orr on the street in the snow wearing a t-shirt and cutoffs, or Michael Orr picking up another player and running down the field with him, or Michael Orr being investigated by the NCAA. Green cards are broad themes, like the evolution of football strategy, or the shift in who's valued on the field. And I just put them on the floor of my office, and I start just playing with the ways it could look. Part of this is all getting confidence in the way you're telling the story. Once I've played with every possible permutation, and I know that the other ones are worse, then I know what's best. It would be silly to introduce James Bond last. You want to know, if nobody knows who James Bond is, you need to establish James Bond in a James Bond story. It's part of like just getting conviction by trying all the other ways. It's a storytelling version of arguing against whatever theory you have. Instead of arguing your case, figuring out what the best case against it is and see if you can beat it. That's what this is. It's like trying to figure out, looking at alternatives and seeing to make sure that the one you think is the right one is the right one. At some point in this process, two things happen. One, I think about what the ending is. Like, where does this book end? Because where it ends is going to tell you a lot about where it should begin. It's like where it ends is your destination. And you're going to begin here, you're going to end here, and there's going to be a path. If you don't know where it ends, you don't know where the path leads. So where it ends is like a big deal for me. And I persuade myself that I know that. And then I persuade myself I know where it begins. And then what happens, it's sort of like everybody has a plan until a punch gets thrown. And that's Mike Tyson's famous line. It applies to writing. The broad meta hack is that if you think about your beginning and your ending when you start, you can structure a relationship between the beginning and the ending. Like, simple one is I'm going to end where I started, for example. It's amazing how a lot of this stuff starts to fall into place. that it starts to tell you how to lay the story out. Structure is the order in which you tell things. How you play this hand you've been dealt. And you can increase your options by just having more material, having more cards to play. That makes it much more fun playing with structure. But the idea that there's one structure that fits all, or that there's any actual rules about structure that you can't break, is insane. That you can do almost anything. It depends on the material. So you got to be open to different possibilities about how you tell. The techniques are pretty simple. It's scene by scene construction. So you're walking into a scene, you're walking out of a scene at the end. It's dialogue. So you're actually having people say things in quotation marks. And so you've got to pay attention to what people say in real life if you're going to have that. And this is trickier, but it can be done, is playing with point of view. Like sometimes you're seeing the scene through, two people are in a room, you see it first through one person's eyes and then you see it through the other person's eyes and you're seeing a completely different thing. So, but there's almost nothing that is done in fiction that you can't steal in nonfiction. I mean, I recognize the distinction in that you can't make stuff up in nonfiction. But other than that, all the tools that are available to a novelist are available to a nonfiction writer. Another effective trick I've used is just ending where you start. It can be used in a novel or short story or even in giving a speech. It's like a circle. One of the beauties of Going Infinite about the meteoric rise and fall of crypto billionaire Sam Bankman-Fried is our main character starts his first 17 years on Earth alone in his parents' house, friendless, without any kind of communication with his fellow human beings. He goes on this incredible journey, and in the end, he's back with an ankle monitor in his parents' house with no friends. It's like you could see that the structure was, we're coming back to where we started. That there's something timeless about coming back to where you start. Even if you have a bad structure in the beginning, that's better than no structure, because that will get you actually putting the words on the page and you can fix it later. I agonize over it. It's good to agonize over it. There's no simple tricks. It's just a rule, you gotta have one. The absence of a structure is like a recipe for writer's block. It's a recipe for freezing up. When I start writing, I'm very linear. I think I'm writing it as a story from beginning to end. I get into the middle of it and I realize there are things that are just wrong. I don't figure that out until I actually start writing it. If I didn't have the structure in place before I did it, I wouldn't even know how to begin. And the structure becomes like a touchstone for me. But very often things just will drop out and other things will slide in. I get myself to a place where I really do think I know what the story is, even if I'm not completely right about it, and I don't figure it out until I sit down and write it. The general advice is shorter is always better. Like, if you think you're gonna write a 500-page book, try to make it a 280-page book. If you think you're gonna write a 30-word sentence, see if you can do it in 15 words. That compression has incredible power. If there's a shorter word, use that rather than the longer word. Verbosity gets in the way of meaning and connecting. So it's like, make it punchier. So The Big Short, ostensibly a story of the financial crisis of 2008. What led me into the story, what perplexed me in the beginning of the financial crisis, is all these big Wall Street firms, one of which I had worked for, started announcing these massive trading losses. Merrill Lynch loses $30 billion. Morgan Stanley loses $25 billion. It was just like Bear Stearns goes down because it's on these bets on subprime mortgage bonds. The Wall Street I had left was rigged for the benefit of the big firms. If the big firms were making big bets, you didn't want to be on the other side of it. Something had happened that had caused the big firms to become stupid and got them on the wrong side of these bets. And it took an embarrassingly long time for me to realize that if they were on the wrong side of the bets, someone was on the right side of the bets. Like, who was betting against the subprime mortgage bonds, who was taking the other side of the big Wall Street firms' bets, who must have made a bloody fortune. And I started digging around and found that, well, indeed, there were all these people who did this. This is a lesson in finding characters. You want to find characters. Characters are better the more they have on the line. Now, they may literally have a lot on the line, or they may just think they have a lot on the line. But characters get better the more at risk they are. And they also get better the less like characters they think they are. People who think they're characters are less interesting characters than people who don't think they're characters. But there was a cast of people, and you could actually get a list. I got a list from people inside Wall Street of the people who had made big bets against the Wall Street firms and against the subprime mortgage market. And there were a lot of small hedge funds, individual money managers. It was a cast of oddballs. I then asked the question, which of these people laid it all on the line? Like, if they'd been wrong, it would have been catastrophic for them. Like, they went all in on this bet. That list ended up reducing to about 15 people, 15 institutions. And then I went around and interviewed all of them, trying to figure out, were there any patterns to how these people got on the right side of the bet? Like, what was it about them that led them to be on the right side? Who would be the best characters? And figured out that there were like 3 buckets, 3 different ways broadly of having ended up on the right side. And this is the first time I really did a casting search, starting with an idea. I picked the 3 characters, one from each bucket, that would best dramatize that particular approach to being right about something the whole world was wrong about. And then I have a problem, because I don't have a single narrative with a main character. I have a narrative about an event with essentially three main characters. And this is yet another example of how, if the real world, when you poke on it and push and look for what the story is, it's amazing how it yields up narrative. And it's not that hard, because they're all in the same space, they're all engaged, they're all fighting the same enemy. It's you know what it is? It's Lord of the Rings.
Tolkien's books are obviously works of fiction, but they rely on the same storytelling principles used in nonfiction.
You got elves, you got dwarves, you got hobbits, and if you watch the way that story unfolds, the Lord of the Rings movie is told, they cut from the elves to the dwarves to whoever, to Gandalf, and you're not worried that you're with a different character in a different situation, because you know that everybody's at war with Mordor. So it was the same sort of thing. The question is, where's it going to end? You're pulled through because they're all involved in the same problem, but you sense they're kind of headed in the same direction, and then they actually end up in the same place. In The Big Short, it's great because they all come together in Vegas in the same conference, and it's effectively in battle. It's a very simple structure. And the existence of a common enemy unifies all the material, even though the people have no idea about each other.
The Big Short is structured, not just around the events leading up to the subprime mortgage meltdown, but also around the characters who foresaw the crisis well in advance. There are devices I use that are good lessons for structure. One is to give each character their own arc, their own story. Another is to make sure the characters are different from each other, that they aren't just the same voice. It's often said I write about complex subjects: mortgage-backed securities, sovereign debt, statistics, genome sequencing. There's something that Leo Tolstoy said that I use at the beginning of The Big Short. The most difficult subjects could be explained to the most slow-witted man if he has not formed any idea of them already. But the simplest thing cannot be made clear to the most intelligent man if he's firmly persuaded that he knows already.
I've always thought, when you've got a reader who's got to have something explained to them, and the thing is complicated, there's no point in even trying to do it until you've got the reader in the frame of mind where they want to know. They have to be hungry for the explanation. If it's going to be hard, they have to want to do it. If you just hit them with something hard, before they want to deal with it, it will just scare them and put them off. And they'll find some excuse to put the book down and go, or the magazine article down, or whatever it is, or turn the movie off and go do something else, because they don't want it. And so the question is like, how you get them to want to know about mortgage bonds, or baseball statistics, or collateralized debt obligations, or pandemic planning in the US government, or government bureaucrats, or whatever it is that sounds just tedious. And the trick is that you create characters you're attached to. One vice that some writers have, the deep desire to seem smart to the reader, that you're trying to actually impress the reader with how smart you are. So you don't actually care if the reader understands, you just want the reader to think you know complicated things. That look what I know, look at these fancy words I can use. And the reader smells that. If that's the place you're coming from, the reader will be alienated. You make the reader feel stupid instead of smart. So you have to operate in the spirit of, it doesn't matter whether the reader thinks I'm smart. I want to make the reader feel smart. The reader can think I'm a little stupid maybe because I've simplified something.
The way I deal with complicated jargon was sort of echoed in the film of The Big Short, in the scene where Margot Robbie's character gives this very simplified explanation of how mortgage bonds work.
Basically, Louis Ranieri's mortgage bonds were amazingly profitable for the big banks. They made billions and billions on their 2% fee they got for selling each of these bonds.
My point is just that Margot Robbie's explanation doesn't need to explain all of the inner workings of the securitization of subprime mortgages.
Someone who is an expert in a collateralized debt obligation might say, well, he left this or that out of the explanation. You've got to leave yourself open to that criticism in order to get to the ordinary reader. You've got to leave people who want to condescend to you able to condescend to you. You've got to be vulnerable. It's a kind of vulnerability. And that's not to say you yourself didn't understand everything that expert understood, but some of it you're leaving out for the purposes of making it understandable to an ordinary reader.
I'm far more interested in telling human stories and entertaining the reader than in giving them some sort of information dump. Let me give you another example of that. My latest book, Going Infinite.
It was set in the world of cryptocurrency. It wasn't about cryptocurrency. It was about these people moving into the world of cryptocurrency and making fortunes from it, who themselves had no real interest in cryptocurrency. They didn't care what a blockchain was. They were just looking at ways things were mispriced and they were taking advantage of it. The characters didn't need to know the Bitcoin technology. They didn't need an 8-page explanation. They wouldn't have cared. So the reader certainly doesn't need it. On top of it, there's some subjects, and Bitcoin would count as one of these subjects, where anyone in the world who really wanted an explanation up till now could have gotten it. I mean, it's been explained 7,000 times. So not only is it not necessary, it's widely available. So you just say to the reader, look, you don't actually need this for this story. I say this to the reader in a footnote. They can listen. You don't need this for this story, and I'm not going to give it to you because it's kind of tedious. And if you really want it, you probably had it already. And if you're half the people in the world, you've had Bitcoin explained to you and then you just forgot the explanation. So I'm not gonna do that again. So this also falls in the category of, to write a story in a world, you have to learn about all kinds of stuff that's not gonna end up in the book. It is very frustrating, it's very hard and almost against your human nature to do a lot of work and then leave it behind. Jesus Christ, I spent 2 weeks understanding Bitcoin, interviewing people, reading all these technical papers, and I'm gonna leave it out? You know, that seems unfair to me. Here is an opportunity for me to seem so smart and show that I understand it. So it's like, there'll be moments where you've done all of this work, you just have to leave out because it's not necessary for the story. And what the reader is internalizing as they read your story is how valuable you think the reader's time is and attention.
If I'm dealing with a complicated subject or a story that's been told a lot, I tend to concentrate on the characters, not on some list of facts. This makes the story feel much more like a work of fiction, and it grabs the reader. In my book, The Premonition, I took as my subject a small group of public health officers who saw the dangers of COVID well before the rest of the country did.
Laura Glass was a 13-year-old and entering the 8th grade at Jefferson Middle School in Albuquerque, New Mexico, when she looked over her father's shoulder to see what he was working on. Bob Glass was a scientist at Sandia National Laboratories, created in the mid-1940s to figure out everything that needed to be figured out about nuclear weapons, apart from the creation of the plutonium and uranium inside them. So this opening bit is about a 13-year-old girl figuring out how the plague would spread in Albuquerque, New Mexico for a 8th grade science project. And in the end, kind of sucking in some of the nation's greatest minds to her school project. And in the end, figuring out a model of disease, of the way diseases spread that gets used by the Bush White House in creating the nation's first pandemic plan. And this idea that, first, it was just incredible that this 8th grader science project ends up having this kind of influence in the world. But the idea that you can model how diseases spread, I needed that in the beginning of the book because it's going to be very important. What people had forgotten in going into the pandemic was that we had these characters in this country who knew how to manage disease spread. They were called local public health officers. They were not called the CDC. They managed disease outbreaks, measles, tuberculosis, whatever it was, on the ground in real time and had been doing it. But they were these lowly bureaucrats that no one paid attention to, yet they had this expertise. And Charity Dean was the top gun of local public health officers, but no one knew who she was. I needed her to just pop. I needed people to say, oh my God. And she did as a real person. So it opens with her faced with this dead body that has tuberculosis in it. And she needs to find out if it's in the lungs, because if it was in the lungs, it had the capacity to spread to other people. To get to that lung, she needed to saw the body open. And nobody would do it. Not the coroner, not doctors. Everybody thought it was too dangerous, that you cut open a tubercular body and you might get tuberculosis yourself. There wasn't a whole lot of evidence for that. Point about Charity is she wasn't afraid. And the scene ends with her outside the county morgue, which is a crappy little building on the side of the interstate with a picnic table in the dirt outside, with this body on top of that picnic table, and a bunch of men in hazmat suits because they're afraid to get near the body, and Charity in cutoff shorts and a tank top, and given no instruments to cut the body open, grabbing a pair of garden shears and cutting this woman's body open, reaching in, grabbing her lung and tossing into a bucket and riding off while the men kind of just melt. And that was going to establish this person, that scene. And I tell you something, this is like a lesson for writers everywhere. If you do have a character, you need to establish, acknowledge the fact and find a way to do it. If you have the President of the United States, you don't have to do very much. But if someone no one's ever heard of and you're going to be insisting on their importance, you got work to do. You've got to do something to insist on their importance. Don't listen to what people tell you about what's important in their lives. That you listen to it, but listen for other things they don't realize are important in their lives, and you will find stuff that had never occurred to them. I spent months with Charity Dean before she told me that story, because she didn't realize how interesting that story was. My jaw was on the floor when I heard that story, and I heard that story, I said, well, my problem solved. I know how I'm going to introduce this character. She told him kind of off the cuff, by the by, oh, there was this weird thing that happened that would never have foregrounded that story in her own telling of her story. After she told me the story, I was running around Santa Barbara County with her, having her take me to places that had been relevant to her experience as a health officer there. I said, okay, we gotta go. I wanna go see this morgue. I wanna be able to describe this scene, so I need to see it. So we drive out to the morgue, and it really is, you can't believe that a county as rich as Santa Barbara County has this morgue. And this is several years after this event had happened. We drive up, and there's this young sheriff's deputy out front just tending the dead bodies. And he sees Charity get out of the car and he goes, oh, she's back. He was like, 3 years later, he was still traumatized. And I just thought, God, it's so great. I could never have written that scene if I didn't go physically to the place. And you got to, like, if you're gonna recreate something, you gotta go try to relive it almost. And so I went in where the body had been stored. I went to the picnic table. We just thought, like, walk through what had happened. So when I came to write it, I had it visualized. If it's in your head as a picture, it's so much easier to get it into a reader's head as a picture. It's like, try to create those pictures in your head. And there's no easier way than actually going and witnessing and seeing the things.
I was pretty immediately sold on Charity, but Charity wasn't immediately sold on me.
In the beginning of the process, a few weeks after I had agreed to help him with this book and maybe be a character in it to some degree, he said, great, I'd like to visit Santa Barbara and go to all of these places that you worked, where the patients that you loved lived. And we went there together, and he drove his own car. It's an older car. It was completely messy inside. It had all of his notes. And as we were driving down the street, I thought, this isn't a chauffeured vehicle. There isn't some false curb appeal about Michael Lewis. People imagine someone who's that successful, they're all curb appeal, but the house is empty. Michael's the opposite. You walk inside and it's rich and full of treasures and discoveries. We get to Santa Barbara, or he meets me in Santa Barbara, and I get in his car, and I look in the back seat, and it warms my heart because it's covered in a teenage girl's softball equipment, girls' hair ties, hair clippies, gum sticks, candy bars. It's all for his kids. Everything in his car is for his kids' sports and shows how much he loves them. But also the back seat is full of all these yellow pads of paper that I recognize as the ones he was taking notes on when he was talking to me. And I said, don't you want to maybe organize? We're driving down the highway and the paper's blowing around and he's asking me questions really fast. And at some point he hands me the pad of paper and he says, what you said is great. Can you write this down? And I will be honest, there were moments in that early part of working together that if he had not been a famous writer and objectively successful, I would have said, to heck with this. This guy doesn't know what he's doing. His notes are unorganized. He's haphazardly asking questions and then rabbit trailing us onto a new subject. How can he possibly remember all of this? And I gotta tell you, right before the book came out, when he was explaining to me his final thinking on the book and the chapters and the way he'd organized it, I was in awe, because Michael Lewis's brain is like a large storage container. You know those storage places you might put old furniture when you're moving, where you drive in and all of the storage containers are locked and you have no idea what's behind them. But he has organized everyone with boxes and files and topics and stories and jokes and ideas. And when he sits down to actually write the book, I don't know how he does this, but it's like he unlocks each one meticulously and begins going through the contents of it. So somehow, driving down the road at 80 miles an hour with the wind blowing and his notes blowing around the back seat with the softball equipment, he was meticulously cataloging the color of a story I was telling him, a detail about my sister, and he would remember verbatim the quotes. And I do not know how he did it. To this day, I don't know.
If the people who tried to teach me science in high school could see me now, they'd be asking what in the hell makes me think I have the brain to write a book ostensibly about infectious diseases. And they'd be right. Before I could even begin to write it, I needed to understand it. I had to learn all sorts of new stuff. So if getting back to the classroom is what it would take to write Charity Dean's story, I'd go back to the classroom.
I think he told me he got a D in biology as a way to not only disarm any nervousness that might be there, but to really contextualize the fact that he literally didn't know this stuff. So it was a joy when he asked me to teach him, and he approached it like this. I'm gonna try and explain to the general public these really complex ideas. So I'm gonna ask you to teach me this 4 or 20 different times. Please have patience with me as I ask it a number of different ways. It's because I'm just not that smart. I got a D in biology, so you're really gonna have to dumb it down for me. And he kept such a sense of humor and kept me laughing as I was describing this acid fast bacilli smear over and over, and kept emphasizing to me, he said, listen, if I don't understand it, nobody's gonna understand it. And I did not realize the brilliance in that method until I read the book. Because when I read the book, I realized, oh my goodness, he understood how to do a microbiology smear for tuberculosis so deeply that he actually explained it in the book in a way that was clear enough that my mother understood it.
I don't think I've ever met a great character who wasn't a little bit guarded. And Charity was guarded, as was Billy Bean. I sensed with Charity that if I was going to get to know her, I would have to do it a bit indirectly. That I have to kind of find a way to walk around in her shoes. And I started in her house.
I wanted to just kind of find different ways to get to know her other than talking to her, because when I talked to her, she was very powerful in presenting the side of herself she wanted to present. She was very careful about how she presented herself. I said to her, could you just give me like an hour where she had 3 sons, just go out and swim in the swimming pool in your backyard and leave me alone in your house with permission to go look at anything. And she kind of looked at me like I was insane. Yeah, insane. But at that point, I had said to her, look, the only way this thing is gonna work, and I'm starting to see something, but I really need to get to know you better in different ways. She was like, there was a sharp intake of breath, and she said, okay. And I remember opening the medicine cabinet, and on the inside of the medicine cabinet were all these little Post-its, and they were all aphorisms about essentially the importance of bravery. In the morning when she opened it, she was bombarded with all these little notes reminding her to be brave, because what she was doing was so terrifying. One was preserving her sobriety, but the other was dealing with deadly infectious disease, also dealing with a bureaucracy that was trying to decapitate her. But it was like, her narrative was, I need to be brave, and the only way I'm gonna be brave is if I remind myself to be brave over and over and over. And I wouldn't have known that if flip over, it was on the inside of the medicine cabinet. That was not designed for public consumption. Metaphorically, at some point, if you're gonna write well about someone, you have to be allowed to wander around their house unsupervised. You have to get to that point where you can kind of do that. And then you need to look. You have to look where they don't think you're looking.
Now, just to be clear, I'm not advising you to go through people's medicine cabinets, though you might do that. I'm advising you to look where they don't want you to look.
I didn't know you were trying to really understand me.
Yeah.
I thought you were trying to really understand the U.S. public health system and the layered jurisdictional authority of police powers in California. That's what I thought you were trying to really understand.
No, that's true too. They're both.
And it was when you asked to go through the house by yourself that I figured out that you were trying to understand me. But I still thought it was understand the way that I thought so that you could understand the larger subject. The moment where I really realized you were digging into my life on the level that you did is when we were having a conversation about my upbringing in the church.
Yep.
And you were asking more and more questions. I don't know if you remember this. And there came a point when I said, that's a boundary. You were digging deeper on some painful moments of my childhood, as usual.
Right.
And I said, that's a boundary. I'm not going to talk about that subject. And you said, no problem. Give me your sister's phone number. I'd like to go visit her in Colorado Springs and ask her all those deep questions. So that's when I realized that you were trying to understand me, was when you went to see my sister.
What did you think I was doing? Since you didn't have experience with my kind of journalism, whatever that is, what did you imagine the outcome of this might be? Like where this was going? Or maybe I'll put it another way. You read the book. When you read the book, is it different from what you might have expected? Can you even remember? And if it was different, how was it different? What surprised you about it?
Well, I figured by about halfway through that year of your discovery process, when you had started writing, I figured that your goal was to explain your characters to the world, just like you would explain tuberculosis to the world.
Yep.
And that's why you dug so deeply and had to understand them,
Right.
Which was terrifying because no one had ever sought to understand me on that level. So when I first read the book, it was jarring. I didn't know what story he was starting out with in chapter 1. And I did not know that he would dive so far into my childhood and what it's like to grow up poor and what it's like to grow up in an extremely restrictive religious environment that asks a lot. Reading it on the page was horrifying to me and very difficult. So why was I mad? I don't entirely know, other than maybe I didn't expect you to be that honest in the book. I don't know.
When you insist on your view of the character, as is your right as a writer, you're likely running up against that character's view of themselves. And there's going to be some conflict as a result of that. As a writer, it's your duty to write them the way you see them and let the chips fall where they may. How did I tell your story differently, generally, from the way you would have told your story if you were just left to your own devices? How would a reader of the book, if you had just written the book, how do you think that would have felt different to a reader than what I did?
I would have attempted to tell the story, and you showed the story. You showed things that happened or events with a description to let the reader have their own feelings about it, where I would have been more inclined to tell them how they ought to feel, because I had worked so hard to frame the narrative in my own head,
Right.
to rewrite the tragedy and failure and loss and hardships into superpowers and scar tissue and becoming a hero.
Right.
You had none of those obligations at all.
Right.
And I think that's what was so jarring about reading it.
Right. Can I put it another way that's
Yes.
maybe less flattering to me? That I was willing to run risks with your reputation that you wouldn't if you were writing it.
Oh my God, that's it.
Yeah.
Yes, that's it.
But I trusted the reader would make the sense of it that they should make of it. But it is allowing the reader to make some decisions about you that you would have been uncomfortable letting them make by yourself. So I'm not a biographer. A biographer, you know, in some ways you got some obligation to put everything in, and it doesn't interest me. What interests me is characters in stories and people in situations. And in that case, you don't have the obligation to tell the whole story of a person. Think of the character as a hand of cards. It's like, what cards do you have and when do you want to play them? And the cards you have, I think, are the cards that are just the cards that are relevant to the story. Like the cards that really belong there. It isn't everything about the character. It's the relevant parts of the person. How you play them, it depends on the situation. But I like to play them holding the deeper cards for later, like holding the emotional punch for later. The idea is that you are having an organic relationship with your audience or your reader. You're not muscling them around and telling them how to feel about the thing you're describing. You're just telling the story. And they will feel how they feel depending on who they are, or how they are in that moment, or what their mood is. The piece of advice I have given actually distinguished writers that they've come back to me and said, I'm glad you said it to me. It's actually helped me get me through my next book. You'll never guess what it is. You think it's something profound.